Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is an enduring anime classic and masterwork, widely regarded as one of the best series of all time, being both beloved by anime veterans and being one of the most accessible series for beginners. Its legacy is certain to last for decades more. You don't reach this level of prestige without having all the right components required for a successful alchemic transmutation. Tonight we'll be exploring all those components and how it makes Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood a masterwork and a must-watch. In the countryside town of Amestris, there is a small rural town named Resemble. Here is where the Elric brothers spend their early youth. Edward the older brother and Alphonse the younger brother. Years after their father abandoned the family, tragedy strikes the Elric brothers as their mother dies of an illness. Desperate, the two young prodigy alchemists perform the ultimate alchemy taboo, human transmutation. In other words, they try to resurrect their dead mother. However, there is a reason such a practice is taboo. Usually, alchemic reactions adhere to the principle of equivalent exchange. But what happens when something as arcane as a soul is involved? It goes horribly wrong. Not only did it not succeed in bringing back their mother from the dead, but it also took a physical toll on the two brothers. Edward lost a leg, and Alphonse's whole body was taken in the transmutation. Desperate, Edward attempted to bind Alphonse's soul to an armoured suit that was close by. This was thankfully successful, but it also cost Edward one of his arms. Disfigured and displaced, the Elric brothers resolve themselves to search for the legendary Philosopher's Stone, a mythical artifact that is stated to bypass all of the laws and restrictions of alchemy. To achieve this goal, Edward controversially joins the State Alchemists, a government-supported scientific wing of the military. Edward becomes the youngest member to pass the entrance exam, earning him the State Alchemist moniker, Fullmetal Alchemist. With government funding and resources at his disposal, the brothers search for the Philosopher's Stone, not to bring their mother back, but instead to undo the damage they otherwise irreversibly did to their bodies. In their quest to find the secrets of the Philosopher's Stone, the Elric brothers get tangled up in a conspiracy that has weaved its influence wide across the land. All of these roads lead to the Promised Day, a final story arc that is downright legendary. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is one of the tightest and most complete stories in anime, perhaps even in serialized fiction as a whole. After it's finished, you don't feel like there's anything satisfying that wasn't covered. It's just done. It moves at a brisk, rhythmic pace with a perfect speed of revealing information and has a real addictive quality to it. I would wager most watchers will go through the final sprint of the story at a quicker speed than they would do with most stories. It is an extremely fun show with plenty of adventure, mystery, and a dash of explosive action, but it also really knows how to land those very emotional beats. In fact, it's quite famous for it. At its core, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is a well-told and well-realized classical fantasy story, both structurally and in its aesthetic. It bears a lot of similarities to fantasy novels, which I think is key to its wide appeal in the Western world. To create a successful fantasy story, you need an interesting created world and a wide cast of interesting characters. But before we can learn anything about the alchemist and the world they inhabit, first we must talk about what is alchemy. Alchemy is the primary magic system of Fullmetal Alchemist, but what makes it really unique is how it's tied to real-life sciences and rules. It is inspired by the real-life ancient proto-science of the same name. Alchemy was practiced in many parts of the world and is part of the evolution of modern chemistry and medicine. In the world of Fullmetal Alchemist, practicing alchemists are able to manipulate and alter matter through a process known as transmutation. To perform transmutation, an alchemist must prepare the appropriate transmutation circle, which can be freshly drawn or already etched into a surface. Then an alchemist is able to direct their energy through the transmutation circle, and they are able to manipulate the matter which their energy passes through. As you can probably extrapolate from that short description, alchemy has an extremely wide range of applications. But before we can really dive into that, we need to understand the limitations of alchemy. You see, alchemy is part of the fantasy genre's long tradition of hard magic systems. meaning that the magic of the world has well-defined rules and limitations. A lot of alchemy's rules can be summarized by the in-world philosophy of equivalent exchange. In order to obtain or create something of equal value must be lost or destroyed, meaning an alchemist isn't able to produce something out of nothing. Transmutation requires the materials to already be present. They can manipulate and alter what is there, but not beyond the material's natural limitations. Not just anyone can be an alchemist though. To be able to successfully transmutate, the user requires a deep understanding of the process and the results they wish to produce, meaning that an alchemist needs to possess a scientific mind and have an intuitive understanding of the natural world. A basic transmutation process can be broken down into 3 steps. 1. Comprehension, which is the alchemist's understanding of the atomic or molecular makeup of the material in the transmutation, as well as how to direct the kinetic energy. 2. Deconstruction, using the energy to break down the material to become malleable. 3. Reconstruction, using energy to direct the malleable material into its desired shape. As you can see, every step requires a deep scientific understanding of the laws of the universe and the materials the universe is made of. This means alchemists have to be quite learned and scholarly. This also operates as a great equalizer for the fantasy world, as it naturally limits the amount of alchemists. While any living person has the theoretical ability to learn and apply alchemy, it's only those who have the fundamental knowledge and true understanding that can perform it. This also means the magic system bypasses the convention of users needing to be mystically special. It is related to a grounded skill people can understand, but also they can naturally possess or learn. It is actually the best example I can think of the common intelligence stat in role-playing games. Often it is quite vague and nebulous how it works with spellcasting, but in Fullmetal Alchemist it is very clear and understandable what the link is between intelligence and the magic system. And if you think about it, the system of alchemy is just science, but the transmutation process is like a spell to access scientific reactions. So why is this detailed hard magic system important? Despite seeming complex, it is extremely easy for audiences to understand the limitation and possible applications of the magic system. You don't need a science degree to be able to intuitively understand the limitations of the world around you. Alchemy just allows people to manipulate those limitations. We as observers understand the limitations of alchemy, so when we see those limits surpassed, we understand the weight of that power. The legendary Philosopher's Stone is said to bypass the laws of equivalent exchange, subverting the natural laws of the universe. The ability to create matter out of nothing or pushing a material beyond its limits. On a smaller scale of rule breaking, we have someone like Elric, who after the human transmutation incident is inexplicably able to perform alchemy without needing a transmutation circle. All he needs to do is press his palms together like a clap or a prayer, almost as if Edward himself is acting like the transmutation circle. Now that we understand the systems of alchemy, we can talk about application. Alchemy is a very flexible art that can be applied to things like repair or medicine, or for example, can be used to minimize the effects of a flooding river. Fullmetal Alchemist explores these use cases for alchemy, but the primary application we see is combat. Alchemy fights are absolutely thrilling and some of the most kinetic and engaging battles in all of anime. The scientific limitations of alchemy add a level of spontaneous intuition and flexibility to the fights. And as we explored, audiences are easily able to understand the fundamental rules of alchemy, making it easy to follow. But it also allows audiences to be able to predict the alchemist's next move. And in turn, audiences can then be surprised by clever applications of alchemy, a system that they actually understand. All alchemists adhere to the same basic framework of transmutation, but their methods and specialities greatly differ in very creative ways. Take the Elric brothers. They have a pretty foundational speciality of alchemy that seems to focus on using the earth and stone around them to form offensive and defensive techniques. Whether that be stone spikes to pierce their enemy, or giant stone hands to pin them down, or even creating helpful platforms. What Edward in particular specializes in is metal transmutation, as he is able to form spears out of sand and manipulate the makeup of his metal arm to create blades. Colonel Mustang is known by his alchemist moniker, the Flame Alchemist. He's able to conduct sparks from his specialty made gloves, which have pre-built transmutations in them, and then he's able to enhance the flame's intensity into controllable explosions and walls of fire. While these are examples of how alchemists can use their art for combat, they aren't the only fighters in this story. Non-alchemists tend to fight with guns like the military sharpshooter Hawkeye, but there are also martial arts experts like those from the country of Xing. While the fights of Fullmetal Alchemist are certainly a draw card for the series, it is far from the series' main focus. It is an action-adventure series, but with a much bigger focus on the adventure, but also the characters and the world. The world of Fullmetal Alchemist is set in a fictional planet not too dissimilar to our own. The central country in the story is Amestris. Its capital is Central City, which is aptly named considering the city, and by extension the country it is situated in, are seemingly in the middle of the known landlocked continent. It is the most powerful nation in its region and has a long history of expanding its borders and conquering territories. Its government is stratocratic, meaning that it's governed by the top military brass, and its head of state is titled as Führer in English translations, which means the country's leader is in charge of both the government and military. As you can imagine with this government structure, the nation is quite militaristic. The country is clearly modelled after 20th century European cultures, but also Western civilization in general. It's easy to see a lot of influences from Germany in the designs of Amestris, especially with the title of Führer being used, but it is far from being directly allegorical with any one single nation. However, there is plenty of historical influences that we can get into a bit later. Amestris is known as the country of alchemists. Being a world leader in the scientific field, alchemists can apply to be government-sponsored state alchemists, giving them a special rank and title within the country's military structure. But the other major scientific difference from our world is automail, being the field of advanced mechanical prosthetics that far surpasses our real-world progress. The prosthetics that Edward has to replace his missing limbs are in fact automail. The world of Fullmetal Alchemist, Amestris, and some of its bordering nations are extremely well realized. It feels like a living, tangible place, and as a viewer we are able to easily explore and understand the land, its rules, and its people. Fullmetal Alchemist has a wide range of interconnected characters that all have their part to play in a larger story and get their time to shine. The cast is full of memorable personalities with their own quirks, often loud quirks. But I think what is most impressive is all the subtle nuances and internal conflicts that are embedded into the characters and their writing. We have characters like Winry Rockbell, a supporting automail mechanic, but also a childhood friend who represents the quiet life of Resemble. We have characters from the military, like the ambitious Roy Mustang, the loyal Reza Hawkeye, the doting father Maze Hughes, the flamboyant Alex Armstrong, antagonistic characters like the vengeful Scar and the mysterious figures dressed in black. At the center of this all, we have our protagonists, the Elric brothers. Both are gifted alchemists and scientific minds, but they are extremely principled and won't waver on their personal values. They have gone through a lot, especially at a young age. Instead of breaking them, this hardship molds them into strong individuals. Also, it's just really nice to have a story with a pair of brothers who are not in direct conflict with each other. They are really supportive of one another and have each other's backs. That isn't to say they can't fight or disagree, but mostly they are on the same page with each other. Despite being so close, they are very different people. Edward is aware that he is often the smartest person in the room. He is quite self-confident and can be prone to being brash, but is also very honest and can quickly admit when he is wrong. When faced with injustice, he is more likely to respond with anger and can be a protector, no matter the consequences. He has a few self-conscious weaknesses, like his tendency to flip out when someone mentions his short height, and hates to drink milk. His large confidence is often tested and shaken. Not to mention the guilt he feels being the older brother who only lost his limbs when his younger brother lost his entire body. One of my favourite quirks about Edward is that when he makes constructs with his alchemy, they are often in bad taste and overly ornate. He is a teenager after all. His creations may be in bad taste, but his sense of fashion is certainly not. Alphonse is more soft and warm compared to his brother, which is ironic considering he is trapped in a large metal body. While both brothers are empathetic, Al is much more so. He has a higher emotional intelligence than his brother and can act more as a peacekeeper. He is also more likely to be emotionally affected and sensitive to the hardships of others they come across in their adventures. Having been robbed of his human body, he is incapable of feeling the sensations we enjoy as humans, such as touch, taste, warmth, and sleep. Despite this, Alphonse is a real trooper, who keeps a positive outlook, but his anxiousness about the possibility of never being able to return to his original body does wear him down. This is a coming-of-age story for both of the brothers. For most of the show's runtime, they are in their mid-teens, and while they are extremely mature and independent for their age, they are still mentally teenagers. They grow and learn a lot during the series, often in very subtle ways. The fact that I can talk about the character of the Elric brothers in great detail without needing to rely on plot point examples should accurately illustrate how realized these characters are. It's genuinely top shelf writing, which extends to all factors of Fullmetal Alchemist, including its theming. Like a lot of fiction, it is difficult to fully explore the theming of Fullmetal Alchemist without delving into the depths of spoiler territory. But here is a surface level look at some of the aspects of its theming. There are two major themes that guide the identity, design, and world of Fullmetal Alchemist. The first is science. As discussed, Fullmetal Alchemist employs a whole magic system revolving around and grounded in scientific principles, and uses the aesthetic and memetics of scientists to form its cast of alchemists. The second is governance. Fullmetal Alchemist examines the role of government and nationhood, especially through the role of the military. What makes these themes especially interesting is how human responsibility, or more precisely, ethics, interact with these themes. The ethics of scientists are often challenged in the narrative, especially with the powers of science being magnified and exaggerated through the alchemy system. It is often questioned as playing God, with how they can manipulate the world around them, but also how it affects people's lives, and where the boundary lies in the pursuit of progress and knowledge. There are smaller examples of this, like the transmutation of gold being banned in the world, as something like that would benefit alchemists disproportionately, but also would break the economy. Then there are examples like Shao Tucker, who I don't need to say much more about. If you know, you know. There is also the role alchemists play in conflict, as state alchemists are required to serve in times of war. With their powers, they are able to devastate their enemies with unmatchable destructiveness. This emulates the role scientists play in times of war in our world, with advancements in technology that create apocalyptic weapons that have questioned ethical boundaries.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
One of the most important events in the story of Fullmetal Alchemist is the Ishvalan Civil War. Ishval is a region on the outskirts of Amestris territory that presumably was once its own independent nation. After an inciting incident, the people of Ishval rose up to protest Amestris' rule. The military cracked down hard on the citizens, causing a long and bloody battle. Most of those who are in the generation above the Elric brothers and are in the military took part in this war, and is a very defining moment for them. For example, Armstrong reacts to the violence of the war with distraught empathy and cannot participate. And in contrast, there are other characters who seem to revel in the mayhem. The Ishval Civil War can have a lot of real-life historical comparisons made to it, including the many conflicts of the War on Terror, which was heavily in the international zeitgeist during the early creation of the manga. It is a brutal depiction of conflict and serves as a sharp critique of war, imperialism, international overreach, and racism. Author Hiromu Arakawa interviewed World War II veterans for inspiration for this part of the story. Fullmetal Alchemist puts these questions of ethics back into the hands of individuals, making it a powerful story of human convictions in the face of ethical questions. The Elric brothers vow to get their bodies back, but not if they need to take lives in order to achieve it. Mustang, after the Ishval Civil War, vows to rise the ranks so he can be a reformer to avoid unjust conflicts in the nation's future. The story questions the cost of the pursuit of advancing a nation's power, or scientific progress, or your own gain. All of these themes orbit around what I would consider the core and most important theme, and that is the value of life. the life in the face of scientific pursuit, and the life in the face of military advancement. The shadowy villains of the story literally use life as an expendable resource, and so do conquesting governments. Even with magical godlike powers, alchemy cannot restore a life that is lost, just like Ed and Elle's mother. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is a slick, well-made show. Even when directly compared to all the technical advances of our modern times, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood stands out despite being nearly a decade and a half old. The fights featuring the alchemists are really dynamic and high octane. The sweeping camera movement and the speed really elevates the impact of how powerful alchemy is. Non-alchemists also get to shine with some amazing martial arts choreography. The Elrics actually get both. The chosen art style really gives life to mangaka Hiromu Arakawa's original artwork. Character designs are thoroughly grounded in reality, but are sharp and full of personality. Little details like Edward having gold blind work for his hair really stands out. The anime also distorts its art style to create menacing images, like the villainous characters covered in shadow with glowing red eyes. The distortion also bends in the drastic opposite direction, creating fun, round depictions of its characters to emphasize the light-hearted moments. There is something particularly precious about round Alphons. The music of Fullmetal Alchemist can be used as a great metaphor for the production of Fullmetal Alchemist as a whole. It is a pretty typical orchestral soundtrack, not breaking the mold in any wild way, but in its execution, it is exquisite. So I have avoided mentioning it until now, but Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is the second Fullmetal Alchemist TV show to be produced. In 2003, Fullmetal Alchemist was adapted into a TV show by Studio Bones. During its production, the team ran into a crossroad as the episodes were fastly running out of currently available manga chapters to adapt. They could halt production or wait for new chapters, or produce filler content to buy time so the manga can develop further. But instead, the 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist anime production team decided to diverge from its source material and to go ahead with their own original story. In a post-Brotherhood world, this 2003 version is somewhat controversial, but perhaps the most common sentiment is that this version has become redundant. As someone who got into the 2003 show around the time of its release, I can tell you that for its time, this was really great. For a few years, we were happy to get something of this high quality, despite it essentially being studio-backed fanfiction in its later half. It was surprisingly well done considering, but at the time it genuinely felt like this is the direction the story could naturally evolve into. Maybe not so much the movie that ended the whole series though. We're not going to talk about that. That is until 2009, where Studio Bones gave the franchise another crack, with an ultra-faithful adaptation of the whole manga. This was Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and they goddamn nailed it. And yeah, that 2003 version is looking pretty redundant now. The 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist show followed the manga pretty closely with its first handful of episodes, albeit with some filler content to stretch out time, and some original content sprinkled in there to set up their divergent story. Roughly around episode 30 is when it started to go fully into its own direction. So when it came to the 2009 series, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, they already had audiences familiar with its early stories. So the early arcs are sped through at a much quicker pace, and some of these stories are outright skipped. Yoki, a reoccurring character, has his introductory story completely not adapted in this version, and is explained in a throwaway line. I don't have many criticisms of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood at all, certainly not enough to be its own section of this video, but the fast pace of these earlier stories is one of my biggest criticisms. I don't mean to depict that it's incomprehensibly fast, it is extremely engaging, entertaining, and comprehensive still. But some of those early arcs have a lot of emotional weight to them, and it feels like some of the breathing room of these moments are missing when we are going at such a quick speed. I understand that those are stories that were on televisions only 6 years earlier, and they want to get to the new material quicker, but in retrospect, it is a little disappointing that the pace had to suffer, because I feel like a slightly slower pace would make the show even more perfect than it is. Probably the most baffling thing they did in the adaptation of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is the entire first episode. They chose to start with an episode that is completely original. I don't like this episode. I didn't like it on its debut. I genuinely think it's a terrible introduction to the show. What a strange choice it is to prove that this is going to be a faithful manga adaptation by starting with TV original content. It speeds through and introduces a lot of the main cast and establishes the main status quo of the series. This legitimately robs a lot of the natural introductions of these characters and concepts and further damages the early pacing of the show. There are some people out there that would advocate that the optimal way to experience the Fullmetal Alchemist franchise is by starting with the original 2003 series and shifting over to Brotherhood when the story starts to diverge from the manga. I can honestly see the value of this sentiment, given that I did criticize the pacing of the Brotherhood version for this section of the show. However, I personally don't think the issue is actually large enough to resort to this. And honestly, it adds too much complication for newcomers of the franchise. Despite that, I will recommend that my advised way to introduce yourself is by watching the first 2 episodes of the original show. It is the intended starting point of the series and slowly introduces audiences organically to this world, the characters, the mechanics of alchemy, and all of the themes. After that, you can move on to watching Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood's episodes 1 to 64 and have a grand old time. You don't have to do it this way, but hey, you came to hear my opinion, right? So here it is. Also, with all this talk about the different versions, I just want to point out that in Japan, the 2009 version is not called Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. The Western releases add this subtitle. It's just Fullmetal Alchemist. Imagine how confusing that is. Notice how the iconic eye catch just says
Fullmetal Alchemist. Fullmetal Alchemist.
There are so many reasons Fullmetal Alchemist is considered one of the greatest series of all time. And tonight, we have only examined the foundational components of the transmutation for this masterwork. It is truly a transcendent series that has stayed with me for a very long time. Alchemy is probably my favorite magic system in any piece of media, but more than anything, this story and its characters are still very dear to me. For those new to the series or anime in general, I hope I have convinced you why Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is so highly regarded and is mandatory watching on your anime journey. For veterans, I hope I've reminded you of the incredible value this series has. If you haven't seen it for a while, I do highly recommend revisiting it sometime. I've been the Neon Spirit, signing out.